Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whenever you happenstance in this truth bomb riff, I am joined by my friend from the great north, the great white north, but it looks like it's a little sunny today out there in Alberta. My friend Regan Boychuk, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, it just time flies. We have been so simpatico for some time, both in our efforts on X and what we've done on YouTube and so on and so forth. And the last couple of months has just been insane, and we haven't been able to record. And I'm so grateful for your opportunity to record today. I see you in your car, but anyone who really cares to get information out there that matters will do it anyhow, anyway. And that's the beauty of social media today, even though that we know there's a lot of downsides. So, Reagan, happy Canada Day. And I believe that, there is so much to try to pack in based on what we've seen for the last couple of months. But I recall that you had some interest in, I think, the 5% rule as it related to Trump. Let's start the dialogue there.
Yeah, I think there's three really big myths about Trump and some of his biggest threats these days. I would argue they aren't really threats, they're reminders. And those big three ones, or the threats about Greenland, about buying it or taking it over, if you know the historical record, it's not a threat, it's just a reminder. We own you, Greenland. We'll do whatever we like, and it's about Canada becoming the 51st state. It's the same thing. It's not a threat. It's a reminder that in 1940 we signed a treaty making permanently subordinating us, and the same applies to this NATO 5% of GDP military spending requirement. This is something Trump has been complaining about for years and years, that American taxpayers are securing the world on their own dime. And now that he's in power, the last NATO summit demanded everybody sign on to committing 5% of their economy to military spending, which is insane amounts of spending. It's a tripling, quadrupling of most countries' current spending without a threat or reason. But to be on Team Trump, rule one is you need a proven record to lie. And that's everyone in NATO has signed up, Canada included. Yes, sir, we will meet the 5% target when you say we will. Canada has committed an extra $9 billion this year to military spending, along with a promise not to raise taxes. So it comes straight out of social spending to get us up to 2%, and then with further promises. But the spending is real. The lack of a threat is real. Even the lack of even an argument trying to justify trillions of dollars of future military spending, all kind of miss a key insight to world affairs that we learned from the economist and historian Michael Hudson 50 years ago. His book, Super Imperialism, about the financial nature of the American empire, taught us that the American dollar being the reserve currency means foreign central banks pay for American military spending, whether they like it or not.
Wow.
It's the
Wow. Well, okay. That's brilliant. And I love that because boy, was I enveloping and immersing myself in a lot of the more recent, uh, you know, uh, podcasts by Ben Norton. And he's been engaged with Michael Hudson. And Michael Hudson is one of my most cherished economists that I've ever had the opportunity to meet in person, obviously, but just in terms of reading and listening and studying over the course of many years, and really going back to the balance of payment systems that he is one of the foremost experts in the world on, which brings me full circle to you. Before we go there, I want to pick up on a couple of key things that you said that I thought is so incredibly important for the audience to understand. And I love that we're hearing it from a friend, in Canada, that you have to lie. You have to buy into the lie because Reagan had just projected that to meet this threshold that they all agreed in, that in the context of there's not a threat that would make sense in this alliance to have that kind of spend. This is from a country who actually cares about its budget and how how the citizens of their country are going to either be kneecapped, the types of things that they have grown up with to understand is a certain uh, sustainability of the society, expectations, promises, virtues, those types of things that make you what you are, particularly in these countries around the world. And what you hit though was you had to lie. And so what we've been discovering recently in a lot of our um, you know YouTube discussions with the panel, including Bill Black, of course, which you and I both deeply appreciate, but over and over, Bill Black has been stressing the context that to serve in Trump's administration, to work in any media that has access, to be in a court, the Supreme Court that was subdued, backdoored, developed, created by these forces in play, that you have to be able to lie. That's what we've been seeing, not just in the United States, but like you've just tapped into the globe. And I continue to think of in that context, Reagan, what did the thumbnail of the con say that we projected 5 years ago? We were all sold a lie. Well, did this lie that we're looking at with Trump in context of this big, beautiful bill that just passed the House because crazy fathead doughboy Vice President J.D. Vance, and if I was coming in from another country, I would be kicked out of the country for saying such a thing. Or if I had, I mean, just ridiculous amounts of insanity based and proclamated in nonstop lies after lies after lies after lies, but that kill, that literally destroy, maim, misery beyond. This is not the cover of Mad Magazine. This isn't, even though it's easy to use that as a reference. We could call him the Mad King all day long, and they bent the knee. Okay, to what ends? Well, in the case of the people of the United States, 16 million people are going to get kicked off of healthcare. We have, immigrants that serve a giant part of our economy that have been here for my whole lifetime. The corporations that hire them are the ones that are at fault, if you want to blame anybody, not the actual immigrants looking for jobs to sustain themselves. We obviously didn't see that, ICE and the Marines in Los Angeles were going after the gangbangers. I know what gangbangers look like. I lived in Los Angeles. I grew up in the Southwest. I know who those guys are. That's not so. The whole thing is a lie, perpetuated on a lie, perpetuated on a lie, perpetuated on a lie. And you brought up Michael Hudson. I'll let you riff on this. But Michael Hudson, years and years ago, as somebody who came up in the system working for Chase Manhattan, and then later I had learned, I'm trying to think of his name. That was his colleague. That was based on No, they created Dr. Strangelove based on his colleague, but
At the Hudson Institute. I know exactly who you're talking about.
right, when you think about that and the character and that exact, I mean, it just explains so much about who Michael Hudson is. But he just literally got inside the international payment systems and how the fossil fuel index and the dollar reserve currency predicated on that, and what we're seeing in Iran now, that's been 5 decades of policy and all of those other things. Look, I'll just leave it to you to take us from here. But again, the entry point is the lie that has devastating and enormous consequences, not just for our country, but the world.
And the reason lying is a requirement is because we're talking about a crime. So that's the prerequisite to play in the game, and the reason why. And so none of this could happen. And I come to this from an imperialism, from a colony perspective. You come from the homeland, the financial repercussions, and you're getting a little taste of imperialism at home. But we come to this because accountants lie. And that's where the resource wealth from America and everywhere else, that's the free gift of nature that comes out of the ground, and it goes to somebody who has a big loan from the bank. And that's where most of the money on earth comes out of thin air as a free gift of nature. The king conquered most of the world, capturing all the gold and everything of value. That's still how it works. And Michael Hudson was a balance of payments economist for David Rockefeller in the 1960s, was hired by the U.S. oil industry to do the balance of payments of the U.S. oil industry, invited in to sit down with vice presidents to get the skinny on flag tankers and foreign tax havens to see exactly how it worked in the mid-60s. Part of the reason he was allowed to do that is because they were about to change the whole game. So it was okay for someone to understand how oil came to dominate the world. And And in the late 60s, he was hired to do the balance of payments for the entire US economy. And he realized that the US economy was in perfect balance. Taxes paid for social expenditures except for the military. The military was exactly the deficit that's exported after 1971 with the end of the gold standard and the American dollar. Michael Hudson's 1971 book said what this means is foreign central banks are going to need to earn their dollars to buy their oil, to turn the lights on. The US just prints them. That's its advantage. And it has a deficit of its military spending. So every dollar, every deficit, every dollar it spends foreign on military is paid for by foreign central banks, whether they like it or not. And in 1971, that book got Michael Hudson a job at the Hudson Institute to present the book to the Pentagon and other such think tanks. He said, Michael Hudson says it became like a textbook. This is how empire works. And so when Trump's going on about we pay for everything, that's just absolutely factually wrong. But like a lot of things he says, it sends a message to people who know how things really work. And our central banker, prime minister, Carney, he understands exactly how that works. And he knows what it means when he demands more, that we're going to pay for that. And it's coming straight out of social spending here. And this is the financial imperialism that I've discovered in the oil industry in Alberta. This is the white imperialism versus the brown imperialism we see in Latin America, where you just send in the Marines, crash the heads, you just steal the oil field. There's nothing. There's a whole genre of that, and you're allowed to talk about that. There's history books about that. There's documents, but that whole time there was a financial, a quiet, a sophisticated, modern banking imperialism. And that's what Michael Hudson was describing. He wanted to call his book Financial Imperialism, but his publisher picked the stupid name of Super Imperialism. It doesn't really get to it. But I think in hindsight, what Michael Hudson's actually describing is just central bank imperialism. He was talking about a very important mechanism. That's the US secret to imperial success. Nobody's ever been able to do such a thing. This is how and why. But that's only the central banks. And that's only part of the story. There's private banks. They operate internationally. They're all kind of tied to the British king and other royalties. And that's what I've discovered in Alberta. There's a whole private banking side of this same imperialism, that when Americans come to Alberta, borrow money from Canadian banks to produce Canadian oil and sell it, we're getting robbed twice, because we're creating money out of thin air, giving it to American shareholders. They take our oil and we repay that loan tomorrow with tomorrow's oil we produce. And that's why we're broken. There's not really, because the banks are really soaking up all the resource rent. And so it works not just with central banks and military spending, but resource development. And the reason Canadian mining companies and the Canadian stock market are the home to the mining industry across the world is because we're an American colony. And those operations carry out the same sort of function all over the world. In Alberta, they dig up hundreds of billions of dollars of oil every year. We Albertans get a nickel of every dollar that comes out of the ground. Our banks lend American shareholders hundreds of billions of dollars a year. They put in their pocket, and tomorrow we work our butts off to repay those loans with future oil production. And so we're being robbed twice, and that's the secret of the American empire. That sort of financial imperialism has always been at the root. In 1925, there was 20 countries in Latin America. 11 of them, the majority, had American officials running their financial affairs. The majority of those were backed up by the Marines. An invasion, Nicaragua, Haiti, Dominica, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. In 1925, majority of Latin America had a quiet American running the budget. That's the kind of white imperialism that was always part of the Monroe Doctrine, even when we thought it was sleeping or not in the headlines. It was always operating like that. And I've come to see that implemented in Alberta. In 1935, a 24-year-old Bible college graduate, the protege of Bible Bill Aberhart, a radio evangelist, started a political party in Alberta. And by that summer, he'd been elected as premier of Alberta, 24 years old. He put the province into receivership, went to Ottawa. The Canadian banks wouldn't lend Alberta any money. The federal government wouldn't give us any money. And this 24-year-old Bible student put the province into receivership and appointed the American executive who had been running Newfoundland, who similarly went into receivership 2 years earlier and had an American official running the province of Newfoundland from 1933 to 35. And as soon as he was done, he came to Alberta, wrote our first budget. And in 1935, we had an American official running affairs in Alberta. And that 24-year-old goof appointed an American to be in charge of oil and gas, the Minister of Oil and Gas. And he appointed an American to start a new oil and gas regulator in Alberta. And on Canada Day, 1938, as a show of our pride and independence, Alberta's regulator was created. On this day in 1938, an American appointed an American to run Alberta's oil and gas industry. And later that year, in November 1938, they held a special session and wrote black letter law to say this agency run by an American is above the law, can never appeal it to any court. They don't even have to write stuff down, and taxpayers will pay for cleanup. And that's what happened in 1938. That's why we're broke here in Alberta. That's how modern imperial, that's what brought me to you. You showed me how Wall Street worked. I'm just here on the business end, seeing how it worked, and connecting the dots between you and me has been like shooting fish in a barrel. Well, then this must mean this. Oh, there it is. Well, then oh, there it is. It's been a financial game, and we're heading into another depression. The banks are about to turn off the taps and turn the pain on debtors, on us.
Okay, let me chime in on that real quick, because God, my mind was racing a number of ways. I don't know how many times in that dissertation, Regan, that I was that close to the name that because it's still right there, and I know right after this conversation, I should look it up while we're talking.
Herman Kahn.
That's it, Herman Kahn, Doctor Strangelove, man. But it was
quite a character.
Yeah, no kidding, especially where I'm going to go with this, because first, let's hit a quick rewind. I'm going to do a compounded, I'm going to do a little bit of a ramp up here, and I'm going to do a compounded question analysis, and then I'm going to turn it over to you because I love this flow that we've got going on again, and it's just kind of profound on Canada Day, right? So close to July 4th, Independence Day, and context everything that's going on, which is insane. But a number of years ago during the Obama administration, we obviously had all the protests because of the tar sands pipeline and everything that was going on at that time period. But I remember really considering just the enormity of Alberta's, just the panoply of what would come from, I guess, drilling. Whether it's a certain level of fuel, and I know it doesn't have that type of crude that Saudi does, but it's much more. The emissions would have been incredible. And that was part of a lot of the reasons why some folks were protesting. But we saw at that time, Obama pretty much placate, opening up the pipelines and everything else. And I know that there was some, movement along those lines the last several years. And now I think we have the pipelines, and I'm not sure exactly where we are in that mix. But as you were talking about super imperialism, which is financial imperialism, and you were talking about South America, the first thing that popped into my mind was, considering that we managed all of their money, I'd love to understand when that started. And I'm just leaving this open ended because it was really the super imperialism selling fraudulent securities in future earnings of South American rubber production that was credited for one of the reasons there was a massive run on the banks, to create the Great Depression. That was part and parcel of what took place, on top of the fractional reserve stuff and everybody gambling with money they didn't have. But there was also a pump and dump scheme that was coming out of the rubber factories, and of course, it was the big American titans in terms of the rubber manufacturers that were extracting those resources from South America that was set against that, but it was mismanagement. And then, of course, probably FOMO, fear of missing out, and all of those other elements that just got the stock market so over leveraged that when it blew up the whole frickin' world, predicated on elements of what you're talking about: imperialism, financial imperialism, processes that we all are just sort of on the downstream, far down the conveyor belt of consumerism. All of these things happen that solidify geopolitics. And to take that history, given what you're talking about, to further reveal the relationship and the reality of a globalism based on this financial structure predicated on lies. Let's not forget lies. And by the way, anybody who believes in the free market, if you look into our work at thecon.tv, you'll discover that one of the most important aspects of free markets are reps and warranties, which all portfolios require, that in the grand context would be responsible to investors, shareholders, but then also the law. But what we discovered when we unpacked everything was that was all nonsense. They were selling fiction the whole time against thousands of whistleblowers, thousands of revelations of truthsayers and regulators that were held down, and all of these other elements by the system that was like, don't ask questions, avert your eyes. The freaking train's coming down the tracks. You do not do anything to slow it down or get it out of the way. But why? Because of everything we discovered, which is control fried, to the leverage buyouts, to all of these elements of financialization over the course of several decades that expand, quite frankly, from the financial imperialism that you discussed from the beginning, which is quite extraordinary. Because what that tells me, right, it informs me they've been kind of the same characters the entire time. And I actually figured that out in my first documentary. Just as a side note, I said to myself, what did I say in terms of the actual revelation? When it's kind of like I had the blindfold pulled off and I knew what I was looking at, which was the emperor's new clothes, which of course what millions of us are looking at with Donald Trump now, because there is no obfuscation. This is a lie in every direction. The Department of Justice of the United States, this last week, we just saw, for example, the assistant deputy director of the attorney general's office was revealed to have just lied in his, committee hearings to be elevated to the third district court for a lifetime term. And he was telling his department at the Department of Justice to lie to the appellate courts on this immigration stuff. And he's stone cold busted. But who's going to stop him? And like we saw today in this insane bill, which is just a dead giveaway to the people who control the system, that we've seen since, I'd say, 9/11, through the great financial crisis, through everything that's happened since to now, it makes sense this would be the end game, Reagan. It makes sense this would be the end game. And right in the sort of time period where it's like, oh, let's revert our attention to the Middle East, to Iran, and to potential war, all predicated on, quite frankly, the control of the geopolitics of that arena to maintain, in my opinion, based on what I've been seeing, is the control of the dollar as the hegemony, particularly as the world's reserve currency, which was a message, I think, to BRICS and everybody else. You think you're going to get off the dollar hegemony? Good luck. So anyway, that was a lot, but please, the floor is yours, my friend.
Well, I think what I've come to realize, the way to think about finance, I don't know capitalism and Marxism. I don't know what capital is. I don't know if anybody else does or knows how to measure it, but the way I look at it and the way that makes sense for how it's changed and what we've been studying is to think about it in terms of collateral. That banking, it spans dimensions. It takes from the future, and there's kind of two versions of it on both sides of your balance sheet, two versions of it, and if everything turns out, they'll balance out and everything will be okay. But in the real world, bad things happen. You have crises. But if you think about a collateral, that explains why this wasn't a problem for 1,000 years. We had kings, we had greedy assholes, but bankers only lent to collateral. Only so the rich guys had 1,000 gold coins, they could borrow 1,000 gold coins to go do something, and if etc. But the thing that changed was collateral went from gold and other hard, real things like that to include oil. And that started in America and Canada as a criminal conspiracy. Rockefellers, Standard Oil, from inception on day one was control fraud, and we should go back and look at it from that perspective. That 1870, some schmuck with no money, his uncle or something, he starts a refining company. Oh, that's great, and he thinks you could make a lot of money if you controlled lots of stuff. Oh, that's a great idea. Within 3 years, he controls 1/5 of American refining, because on February 26th, 1872, every oil man in America woke up to a criminal conspiracy that Rockefellers and their friends didn't have to pay a new railway tax. So everybody else was going to have to pay this tax. And the whole growth of Standard Oil to have a monopoly on world production came out of this criminal conspiracy. The law didn't apply, and they would do anything. But they were untouchable. Couldn't get him in court, couldn't nail him down. Imperial kind of secrecy. And in that same secrecy, John D. Rockefeller retired in 1897. He wasn't even 60 years old. 15 years later, when they're trying to break up Standard Oil, they don't even know that he retired 20 years ago, because that's how secretive he is. But he's still legally on the hook. Everybody on the board knows, oh, he's the man. He's still liable. They just don't tell anybody he's retired. And he's happy to take the fall like he's a made man or an imperialist or something. He has no worry in the slightest about it. In 1897, in 1898, Standard Oil secretly bought the Canadian oil industry. Imperial Oil was created as a consortium of all the Canadian producers, supposedly to keep out the Rockefeller octopus. But the Liberal government in Canada, that was saved in 1892 with tariff threats and a trade war, kind of like what's going on today, and that really boosted up the Liberals and got them reelected. What they did when they got reelected is they changed the laws so that the Rockefellers could secretly buy Imperial Oil. They paid out a $93,000 dividend to all shareholders to make sure nobody had any problems or would ever say anything about it. And so by 1899, when the British Navy started considering a shift to oil, the Rockefellers had a complete monopoly on world oil production. Rockefeller controlled 90% of American refining, secretly controlled the Canadian oil industry, which they'd known since the 1700s has hundreds of billions of barrels. And so this has been the secret pile of collateral that imperialists have had. That's their secret. Imperialists don't buy oil, they steal it. And so it's $100 a barrel. That's gravy. It's tough if you're in Japan or Germany. You got to work hard to earn that money to buy $100 worth of oil. But the British and the Americans steal it. And that's what I realized when I looked at the accounting in Alberta. I looked at the amount of money coming out of the ground and the amount of money going into the provincial budget. And if I'm just a roofer, but it looked like we were being robbed. And so for 20 years, I've been asking accountants and professors, like, well, just explain, we're not being robbed, are we? Like, explain how I'm wrong. And they can't, because in 1940, Franklin Delano Roosevelt amassed 100,000 American troops on the Canadian border in Ogdensburg, New York. Spent the day with his Secretary of War, 21 guns saluting and getting them ready. And he invited the Prime Minister of Canada to Ogdensburg, New York on August 18th, 1940, on the eve of war, and had us sign a 110-word treaty. It says nothing, but it means we're going to set up a military council for the US and Canada. It's going to have a majority of Americans and a minority of Canadians, and it's permanent. You're just going to be permanently subordinated to Canada. And the Prime Minister went, he was there alone, unannounced, unaccompanied, signed it, rushed back to the Governor General's residence to inform the British Crown about what had happened. And that's the moment when even the most esteemed Canadian right-wing military historians, that's the moment when we went from a British colony to an American protectorate. And that's what explains why we're being robbed of all this oil and where all the money's going. And the con explained how that worked financially. And just connecting the dots between the two has been the shortcut to connect. Alberta, Canada has a unique banking system where there's no banks don't have reserves and transactions don't go through the central bank. So if on April 9th, 2003, the U.S. Energy Secretary formally recognized 175 billion barrels of Alberta oil as legal, proven reserves for the first time in history. On April 9th, 2003, the same day that the statue in Baghdad was pulled down by the Marines, that was the day that bitumen the British found in 1715 became legal collateral that you could take to a bank and print new money with. So on April 9th, $9 trillion of Alberta oil became legal collateral. And it was in the Rockefellers' back pocket since more than a century. But it took that long, a few false starts, but that's the imperial time scale. It's well worth it. But we're at the tail end of that. It's the Alberta oil that was the collateral that sent Wall Street door to door in Detroit to give out mortgages. They had $9 trillion of legal collateral they could print out of thin air as long as they could find some sucker to make interest payments. And as soon as he couldn't make interest payments, you get his house. Win, win, win. And you're off to the races once again. This is a crime of unimaginable proportions. So naturally, in a colony like Canada, unmentionable in academia, unmentionable in the media, this story can't be told. It's beyond taboo, but it should be of interest to the rest of the world because Americans control enough carbon to kill us all. There's nothing in between them and all that carbon, and they don't have any intent except to produce it as quickly as they can without unnecessary waste. The rest is inconsequential, and that's what we're living through and seeing, and that's why there's a buildup in Iran and there's an invasion. They don't even bother giving excuses anymore. In 1991, Yemen was the only country that didn't sign on to the Iraq war at the Security Council. And they paid a big price because the U.S. put that much stock in the unanimous support for their imperial war. In 2003, they tried. They put a big show on. They made a case. They didn't get the same sort of UN support. But today, it just happens. They don't even make an excuse. And I think what it means, if you listen to YouTubers and all kind of international affairs, foreign policy, all of it is a moral story about how stupid these guys are. They're just stupid. They just don't know. We're smart, we're moral, and we know history, or we could learn from yesterday. So we're not, but they're all stupid. We can't, that makes no sense. We're obviously, our analysis, there's something missed. They're not stupid. They know what's the logical consequences of their actions. So we should analyze it from that perspective. And so besides the war, the genocide in Gaza and the support for that, that's just like there is no more international court of justice. There's no more human rights. There's that whatever facade there was or whatever structure that could be used to some good, it's gone. And I think that's what the attack on Iran meant. The imperial decline is real and it's quick, and they can't, but what they can't, and so they knew Iran is going to get its back up. You're not going to, the nationalism, they knew they couldn't accomplish what they claimed they could, but the real effect of what they did was the United Nations, international law, that's one. I studied I wanted to be an international lawyer. I did Mal UN, but that system is gone. It's done. We just had a rogue state attack Iran, who's in negotiations, who's in compliance, who's in the NPT, and then the U.S. And there's not even a word, a peep, let alone anything. Like the reason they did that is to just draw a line in the sand. There's no more international law. we're back to the 19th century. We could forget about all that. We reserve the right to do that again at our leisure. And that, I think that's the real meaning. And I think it does make sense. There is a logic to it, and it runs through Wall Street. It is a crime, and it can be stopped. You work with all the guys that figured out the last round, and the same answers will still work. You have the team that can dismantle this from the inside because it's being turned against all Americans
Look, I got to
at
jump
the
in
end of the day.
there. I got to jump in there because you were, first of all, that was brilliant. And you set two things up that were so important to me in terms of, I'm going to address the last part first because I do want people to understand that, yes, indeed, I'm a very fortunate guy, but I'm in the matrix, in the intersection of some of the most powerfully capable former prosecutors, state AGs, guys from the DOJ, the people who have been fighting these wars against financial fraud for now decades and have been the most, quite frankly, capable that we've seen anywhere in the world, anywhere in history. Part and parcel because it was the United States and we did believe in the rule of law. And it was something that was actually a line in the sand. But as Reagan had just demonstrated, and this is the second part of what I wanted to address, there's this guy that continues to kind of ride a lot of the stuff that I lay out there. And he's elevating this discussion. He's a smart guy. He's a guy, I think he studied engineering at I'm trying to think of Carnegie Mellon in Pittsburgh. So I think his bona fides are actually legit. But he has this argument that no, it's the international rule of law that subjugates the American system, and that's why we have all of these problems we do. I'm like, you're nuts. And so you just made that case for me coming from Canada, because I'm like, I can show you in every single direction from 9/11 forward that international law has been diminished repeatedly, and I'm very well aware of a lot of things that did and did not happen in the UN over the course of the last 25, 30 years. But further to that point, it's the Constitution of the United States that actually is meaningless at the moment. International law is meaningless. The Constitution is meaningless. We're celebrating Canada Day today, which, maybe you can give us more deep dive into the perspective and what we should know and think about on this day. But I'll tell you, in terms of July 4th, my friends, and the Declaration of Independence and everything that it is that we supposedly hold dear has been completely brutalized, raped, pillaged, destroyed right in front of our freaking eyes through the complicity of this contextualization of this insanely diabolical grift of corruption that has manifested all of the institutions that are there to prevent what Reagan and I are revealing to you. That's the entirety, the whole purpose of July 4th and the American experiment, i.e. the Bill of Rights and Constitution, because we had a revolution against tyranny. And I think to myself, it's 2025, and we have tens of millions of people that put on a fake red cap made in China and literally proclamate that they're the law and order party. And it's like, you're liars, like everything else we've demonstrated. You buy the lie, you are the lie. And in the United States, ignorance of the law is not an excuse. So I make that broader case that if you're dumb and you didn't go to class and you don't even know, I don't know how you got through high school, let alone college, and where you ended up in the world, but you don't understand the society we're supposed to be. And the reason why Reagan has put so much emphasis in our efforts, because he realizes from a person living in another country that the only way their country can find the rule of law and the balance and justice and those things that we all, as thinking people of the liberation, I'm going to go back to the French Revolution, liberté, fraternité, and the third aspect of that, the three-legged stool. But if we can't emphasize it enough, what I have been watching in slow motion since 9/11 is the complete hijacking and perversion of the rule of law in the United States as a democracy that can hold power to account by unbelievably brilliant but diabolical grifters of deception that are technocrats for billionaire apparatuses that will shove this shit sandwich down your throat until you die or you fight back. That's tyranny. And so, to finish that concept briefly, that Reagan so kindly had set me up for, I do have to just reveal for those of you watching this, we have a new effort, but it's built on the same effort that we've done the whole time called the New Untouchables. But we're going to utilize these incredible legal scholars that have been in the apparatus, who know how the system works. They're going to create a diffuse diversion of power to bring lawsuits against the overreach of Trump's unconstitutionality and his fascism of going after victims of ICE, going after victims of tariffs, and I want to have you comment on tariffs, Reagan, going after, quite frankly, all of us collectively that are being pigeonholed by the Goebbels-like propaganda of Elon Musk's tech giant sectors, if it's X or if it's Facebook and Zuckerberg and all the rest of it. They can exist free of libel, even though they're propaganda platforms, because of this thing called Section 230. So we're going to plow into that. So in addition, and finally, we are creating a network hive of whistleblowers because, as Reagan knows from our work in the in the con that you can find at thecon.tv, I worked with an outfit out of DC called the Government Accountability Project, who've been the forerunners of all the whistleblowers of all the biggest devastation in corporate America or war or whatever, going back 40 years. These are the best of the best, and they are now introducing us to 2,000 plus whistleblowers from the Trump administration that we're going to have to work with state legislatures and district courts around the country to bring these suits and these revelations. And we're going to have to pound, 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 pound the truth into the heads of those who continue to have their heads in the sand and their backside in the air. So like George Carlin said, however many years ago, so you can have that red, white, and blue dildo shoved right up your backside, So thank you for letting me run that with that. But I want to get your thoughts given everything I've said, because it is all interconnected. It is all of this piece of this puzzle of this financialization, which we call neoliberalism, that's run through the geopolitics of the last many decades, that is ultimately super imperialism, i.e. financial imperialism.
This is all one giant long story about the rule of law. There's always been these crazy monarchs convinced they're better than the rest of us. Nothing applies to them. They lie, cheat, and steal, take whatever they like. And that began to change in 1215, 1214, with the Magna Carta.
I was about to say the Magna Carta.
That was in the Western world, that's the first glimpse. That was the first hint of democracy, of rule of law, of some limit on this godlike figure ruling over us. And so when it comes to royalty, that is the most despicable, despised conception event on the face of the planet. And so on St. Edmund's Day, November 20th, 1214, a conspiracy started that led to the Magna Carta. A bunch of elites were unhappy with the evil king who was in a desperate war, and they took advantage and started the Magna Carta conspiracy. 6 months later, on June 15th, 1215, the Magna Carta was signed. Half of Britain was under foreign occupation. The king was absolutely desperate for the allies, the bishops and the priests that were in this, and so he signed the Magna Carta. War was still on. It didn't mean a whole lot, but it had been signed. And so when the war ended on September 11th, 1217, a 9-year-old king was in charge of Britain at the time. And on that day, the Magna Carta came into force, came into effect on September 11th, 1217, the most despised day in the history of all kings and queens. They hate it. So those 3 days, November 20th, June 15th, and September 11th, Those days embody the Magna Carta. They embody the popular demand for the rule of law. And those days were key to the British Civil War, the first Western democracy, the levelers, the diggers, the first real kind of democratic movements. They took their big moves on those anniversaries of those days, evoking that rule of law sort of thing. And so now in reverse, um, imperialists use those days to strike blows, but other things like the American Revolution, those were blows for the rule of law that tried to break those corrupt. Whether it was 100% true or 80% true, it existed. It inspired people. It was the right way. That's why it inspired people. And so that's why America is unique. There's no other place in the world that's ever had any sort of independence from this monarchical crime wave for centuries. And so whatever exists in America is unique. And the only time it ever happened when anybody capable and was in the right position that did it was your friends in the 80s that used the rule of law, imperialist kryptonite, to dismantle some of very similar crimes that they watched happen again and were in the midst of happening again. But Canada Day in 1867, July 1st, 1867, that's when the Commonwealth of Canada came into effect. It wasn't a blow for the rule of law or democracy. They just invented a new kind of colony. We weren't an independent state. We didn't have a constitution. We didn't have the rule of law. We were a dominion. Still, that was a bit much for the Americans who always had their eye on Canada. And so this is a step in the wrong directions. Americans did not appreciate it. Congress passed bills about incorporating Canada. There was a big movement. They did not like it. And to send that message, the same day that the Queen passed the legislation in 1867 that created Canada, the US bought Alaska as a statement of, we own you, we're boxing you in. They paid many times too much to make the point on a specific day that they were dissatisfied with this colony. But in 1867, on Canada Day, that didn't include Alberta. We were just a shaded area on the map, the Northwest Territories. We still belonged to the King, to Hudson Bay Company, to the Prince Rupert of the Rhine, who sent from Britain to establish Canada, and the Hudson Bay Company. And that's where all the oil is today. I'm sorry I've got myself going in circles here, but
Well, no, you didn't, dude. But when it was brilliant, though. But I loved how you came full circle to Canada Day, and that perspective is incredible. But it is also, I mean, look, let's not. Well, see the nature of the American sort of evolution, the way I see it, right? And we know that, as I thought you very correctly and appropriately demonstrated, that for whether it was an 80% or 100% of what the effort was in terms of its, ideological purity, so to speak, we know it was flawed, but at the same time, yeah, no, they did kick the king to the curb, and the East India Trading Company and the Royal Navy and the Redcoats, and we were victorious. Yeah, and so the American people generally, as it evolved, with all of the challenges between the Federalists and the states' rights and so on and so forth, and that that tug of war that would evolve into the South, and it's of course agrarian society and agriculture versus what would evolve in the North eventually, in the industrialization, but in the context, of course, the migration, the opening of the borders to all of the immigrants that wanted to escape the tyranny from overseas, that would in their own way provide tyranny to the native peoples and so forth. So it's always been this incredibly difficult and never perfect journey by any means. But what I'd like to just kind of pick up on in terms of what you were impressing upon me, in where I come from, is there has always been a very independent streak of Americans, and that has always overrun our incapacity to submit, to bend the knee, to yield to injustice, even though, of course, there's so many elements of our society that are unjust. But we have a wholesale for sale sell off of every single thing that made us what we were in battle after battle after battle, and what you might want to call it conquest, but victoriousness, from the Civil War in the North to break the bondage of slavery, for better or for worse, because Jim Crow survived. But then we end up fighting fascism with our friends from Canada, of course, to your original point, and everything else, and all of the other English speaking countries around the world that, all basically combined to defeat Nazi Germany. And then, we created this system afterwards, but it's always been a struggle. You think about, of course, MLK and the civil rights movement. You think about the Voting Rights Act. You think about that era that was, of course, everything I'm demonstrating and then some, right? Because we're in Vietnam, which is just what more imperialism. And then ultimately, while at the same time, there's this democratic movement in the United States that comes from really an educated middle class. Without the educated middle class, a dynamic structure, a majority of the people that would hold character and honor and integrity and the rule of law above the wholesale rape and pillage of everything that matters to us. And what I'm emphasizing at this stage of the conversation, and I hope I'm doing it effectively, because I'm telling whoever's watching this from the bottom of my heart, and inspired by my friend Regan from Canada. There's no time to wallow in a moment of, damn, they got this big, beautiful bill over the finish line in the Senate. Damn, we can't fight back. Damn, this idiot Mad Magazine, Mad King president who's lied 5,000 times to the American people, got his wife from frickin' Jeffrey Epstein, and everything that elucidates in light of, I'm going off on a stream of consciousness, but Elon Musk, threatening, oh, I've got the goods on, Jeffrey Epstein, however many weeks ago now, in context of everything that happens in between in this overflow of information. Well, at the same time, what Reagan and I are telling you is that it's all a facade, it's all a front, it's all a distraction to maintain and continue this incredible betrayal that's controlled by this international consortium of financial capitalism, which I'm going to call monopoly capitalism. Donald Trump didn't create that. Donald Trump is the result of that. Donald Trump is such a freaking buffoon idiot. He couldn't even get on first base, because I don't even think he went to class when he was going to business school at Wharton. I think that was a facade that Daddy Fred Trump paid for. And then why would Wharton graduate him? Oh, yeah, there's a question for you, right? And then ultimately, like I've shown in many of our Truth Bomb, I've had these sessions with this guy, David K. Johnson, who's shown over and over and over that Donald Trump has been up to his eyeballs in the stuff that Reagan and I were just telling you, whether it was from the junk bond scenario back in the 80s and 90s, particularly in his casino up in New Jersey, all the way through him money laundering, quite frankly. Sorry, you've got that son is great. I think it's great. You look almost
Mhm.
heavenly in there, like the, the Grateful Dead said, sometimes the lights are shining on me, but other times I can barely see. But to finish this thought, man, Donald Trump was laundering money from known international drug traffickers that built Trump Tower. The guy has always been a part of organized crime. And the fact that he was able to rise and not go down, to all of these different chicken shit club prosecutors and DAs in New York and in Jersey that went along with the scam, because later he becomes this sort of national, figure that's in newspapers, and then later on The Apprentice and blah, blah, blah. They normalized him, right? That's what they did. They normalized this clown. And Jeffrey Zucker, Jeff Zucker, Zucker at CNN, and Les Moonves at Paramount CBS said, yeah, we needed Trump for ratings. They played roulette. The media played roulette with our democracy by hyperinflating lies and lies and more lies and lies. And the whole thing is a freaking lie. So one thing I'm going to finish up with here, and I'm going to give you the last note, but your light has inspired me because I used to finish all my truth bombs with this, Reagan. You know, when you live in truth, when you live in light, you live in truth. When you live a lie, you are depraved. When you have the truth, you're bulletproof. When you lie inside, you die. Stop lying. Stop buying lies. When you grab onto the nuclear, when you become a nuclear reaction vector to the Big Bang of truth that we're talking about, you become the force of light that overcomes the darkness. Your final words.
And you've been saying that for some time, and now the game is over. All of the games are over. The environmental, financial, political, the games have all stopped. This is it. From the IPC, the tone of the last IPC report, to SWAT teams taking down casual laborers at Home Depot. Like, you have the folks, you have a plan. What's missing is the rule of law. That's what is the disconnect between what we thought we had, how we thought things work, what was supposed to come from our lifetimes of hard work. The reason we never got that is because we didn't have the promise of America, of liberal freedoms and competition to keep costs down. That's an illusion. We don't have that rule of law. That's what I found in Alberta. When we get down, we're a colony. There is no rule of law. Well, then we're going to have to go down south to solve this then. And what America is finding out, under the surface, had been working, that built up this. You haven't had an oligarchy like this. You didn't used to have trillionaires. There was Rockefellers and Morgans, but it's not like today. Well, you can't even keep track of the billionaires. There's so many of them. You don't know what they did. They robbed foreign countries like Canada. The amount of money extracted from Alberta in the last 20 years, that's where your explosion of billionaires has come from. And so the rule of law is the missing ingredient, the missing link. And it is big, but it's solvable. And the upside of what I have to offer of what everyone is facing is the financial side. The scale of the theft involved in places like Alberta means that different world we need, there's no question about how to pay for it. You establish the rule of law, you end the looting, and all of a sudden you have public control over trillions of dollars. There's only 5 million Albertans. We've been robbed trillions. We should be living like kings. We should be helping everyone else. We should be doing everything right. We can afford it. And only if we have the rule of law, then we also have control. We have all the resources we need. We control what is beneath us. Your country belongs to the citizens. You can prioritize it, use it within boundaries, transparently, responsibly, accountably. That could all be done, but not without the rule of law. And that's what I've learned the hard way, which has brought me back to your work and it's the rule of law at home in America. Humanity is doomed unless very soon Americans rise up again, live up to their ideals, reestablish the rule of law. Then there's a chance for the rest of us. But otherwise, I should find a new hobby because there's nothing I can do here without your help. But America, as flawed as it is, also holds within it the answers. And you have the team. They did it before. We're about to be on the business end of it. So organizing things like unions of the victims of ICE, unions of mortgage holders and debtors and renters, that's the way we can start turning isolated victims into organized forces that can cause concessions, change momentum, change the story. We don't have any choice. We're going to be crushed. There's a recession coming. The banks are going to stop lending money, and then everything is going to slowly creep to a stop, and it'll be blamed on a million other things, but the banks will stop printing money and lending it to businesses. They'll stop hiring people, stop building new things. It'll dribble down. You won't be able to pay your mortgage. You'll be homeless. It's because the banks are about to turn it off, because they're about to rewrite the system because they win again when they steal your home, and their power is still growing all throughout the recession while we're being destroyed. And it is a zero-sum game. It is over. And so thank God there are folks like your team that know what they know, did what they did, and those is still tangible. There's still a path to a sustainable future, but it leads through the rule of law in America.
Well, and to that point, first of all, I want to say thank you for that. Incredibly inspiring and in solidarity with our friends to the north, man. If there's a globalism, it's with liberty seeking justice, people all over the world that believe in dynamism and the rule of law. So, on that note, we walk in solidarity together and we're going to fight like crazy to make sure that we double down on what you just proselytized to us because, and I hope that doesn't bother you, but what I felt was it just electric currents in my soul because to know this in my heart, in my own four walls of my universe is one thing. To know it that a guy who lives thousands of miles away from me sharing the same look is just so incredibly important. And by the way, I will put in the description below your articles. Please share those with me. We'll get people to, look into you. We want to get your journalism out there. You are definitely a fabulous independent journalist. We want to see more of it. Hopefully, we'll build a network as we go further to demonstrate. And this is part and parcel of my big picture objective is to create a new media machine that's just going to crush lies. I'm a competitor. I love the truth, and the truth is wonderful, especially when the bad guys are getting away with lies. I can spend the rest of my life, fighting that, and I will be fulfilled. That is my fuel.
Like Bill Hicks used to say, there's a good market there.
Right on, man. And so, and in closing, with the nature of one of the thoughts that you had just expressed that I wanted to pick up on, you know, again, like you said so demonstrably, there is no more time left, but there is time. But you have to like, subscribe, and share. The crazy thing about this algorithm, and I hate it when I hear other podcasters say that, but that's the way it's written. That's the way the system works. If you're tired of being fed a shit sandwich of lies, you have to dig into the truth. And we've got mountains of it. And again, for all of you out there, and I experienced this in a No Kings rally not too recently. I mean, recently, I should say, where someone sat at the podium and just tried, and she was a young person, and she was trying to make a point about the truth being subjective, faith based and this, and nobody holds the truth, right? And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, you poor girl, you don't understand. Yes, there is a difference between ideology and faith and all of the other isms that are way out here in the ethereal land that we can live by and tap into and live a life of value that we might regard as truth. But that's different than the truth of the justice system, of the legal system. There's cause and effect, there's laws, there's remedies, there's evidence, there's all sorts of different machinations of different ways that the truth has to be presented for there to be an outcome. That's the entirety of the justice system. That's an entirety of the law. And the whole point is, and the founders of the United States wanted to make it so difficult for a tyrant to be able to slip past the nooks and crannies of being held accountable. That's the entirety of the Constitution. In 248 years of history, we're about to celebrate the 249th anniversary of the 4th of July, the Declaration of Independence. If that doesn't fire you up and turn you into a nuclear reaction vector, I don't know what else will. Put your head in the sand, go hide in a closet, but let the rest of us who actually give a crap about the world and the values of truth. And I'll say this to finish. I found this really interesting recently. Somebody said this, and I know you and I, Reagan, subscribe to this theory. I asked someone recently. I said, "What is the value of truth?" And this person thought about it for a second and responded, "Well, the truth can only have value to people who value the truth." Okay, well, anybody who doesn't want to be thrown into a gulag or starved to death or having everything that is rightfully theirs stolen from them wants to regard the truth, because that's the only way you get justice. That's why it's liberty and justice predicated on truth. Anyway, that is really all it's all about. And so, unless I think we've both done some tremendous stuff here. Again, Regan Boychuk, everybody from Alberta, Canada. I'm going to put his writings down below. I'm so glad we connected. Happy Canada Day to you. Let's keep it going. It won't be 2 more months before we have another dialogue, my friend. We'll keep this going, my friend.
Right on. Take
Onwards
care.
and upwards, everybody. Take care.